Good evening, everybody, to 10th Clinic of Advanced Gastro Summit 2020. I, Dr. Yogesh Harwani, on behalf of Association of Physicians of Ahmedabad and Noble Gastro Hospital Ahmedabad, welcome you all to our 10th clinic. Today, we have a very experienced and senior hepatologist from our country, Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor. It's an honor for us he has accepted our invitation. I would like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Chirag Desai, who is a transplant surgeon, liver transplant surgeon at Apollo Hospital, Ahmedabad. Thank you, sir, for being with us today. I would like to request you, please introduce our chairpersons, and one of the chairperson will introduce Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor, today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. And we must congratulate you for this initiative. And all the talks have been very good so far. So today is the 10th clinic, and the topic is very good, that do all cirrhotics need transplant? And we have Dr. Kapoor, who is the most appropriate person to talk about this. We have two very appropriate chairpersons today. Dr. Sudhanshu Patwari, who is our teacher also. He's the senior most hepatologist and gastroenterologist of Ahmedabad. He was a teacher at our NHL Municipal Medical College for a long time. So, sir, thank you and welcome to this clinic. Our another chairperson today is a very close friend of mine, Dr. Chawda, who is a hepatobiliary and liver transplant surgeon at Sterling Hospital. And I would request Dr. Patwari to introduce Dr. Kapoor, and then we can start the talk.
Good evening, friends. And thank you, Yogesh, for inviting us to this clinical meets. And I thank Chirag also for a very decent introduction. Thank you, Chirag. I would like to introduce Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor, who is one of the pioneers of liver transplantation in India. And he has been to Ahmedabad also for this CMEs many times before. And he is an excellent teacher also. And he is the right person to discuss with us, do all cirrhotics need liver transplantation? Because we have so many cirrhotic patients. And you must have observed that child A cirrhotics, many of the patients will continue in the same condition for years together, and they may not need any intervention. So it is not that the cirrhosis means liver transplantation, and we can definitely manage medically also. And no other person than Dharmesh, who is really a very close friend also to me. He will discuss the liver transplantation in cirrhotics. Thank you, Dharmesh, for accepting our invitation.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for that very kind introduction. And thanks to Yogesh for making me a part of this edition, which is an excellent initiative. I keep following and tracking these clinics, and I hope that today one can do justice to the topic that has been assigned to me. So I'll just share my slides. Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Are my slides seen?
Yes, sir.
Is it full screen now?
Yes, sir, it is.
Sure. So the topic that has been given to me today is liver cirrhosis. Do all cirrhotics need liver transplantation? So let's first see how we define cirrhosis. So cirrhosis is actually a condition in which the liver, it undergoes the process of necroinflammation. That means there is ongoing cell death, which incites inflammatory response as well as laying down of scar tissue. but this is only one part of what goes on in the liver. This is also associated by intense changes in the architecture of the liver, in the angiogenesis of the liver, and it also modulates what is entering the liver by way of the blood supply, and that is what actually leads to portal hypertension. So the splanchnic circulation, which finds its way from the intestines into the liver by way of the portal vein, that also gets modulated by this ongoing injury that is happening in the liver. So if you have to just define as a metric, it's only regenerative nodules. That means the regeneration does not occur in an orderly fashion, forming an acinus which is present in the native liver, as well as there is laying down of scar tissue, which over a period of time becomes mature. So each and every word of what I say has got some meaning as we define the natural history of a patient who's got established cirrhosis. So typically we say that cirrhotic patients are of two kinds. A, compensated, that means the liver is scarred in the manner that I just described, but it still continues to function well. And B, decompensated, that means the liver is not only scarred, but it has also lost some of the key functions. And we will talk in a little while what these functions are. So what about the global burden of disease? And this is a recent publication from the Lancet. So as you can see that both the number of deaths as well as the age standardized death rate over a period of time, which has been shown in this bar diagram from 1990 to 2015. So the number of deaths has been steadily increasing, whereas the age standardized death rate has been coming down. However, what this graph does not tell you is that the disability associated life years, they have been increasing over the last 2 decades. The number of patients with decompensated cirrhosis, that has been going up. We've been doing well for most etiologies of liver disease, which includes primarily hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and alcohol use disorders. But we have not been doing so well when it comes to NAFLD NASH cirrhosis. So that is one condition in which the age standardized death rates have been steadily mounting. So the problem of liver cirrhosis is a huge problem. We do not have the data or community-based data from our country, but it's a global problem. And cirrhosis is recognized as the 12th commonest cause of death in human beings all over our planet. So this really is a very serious problem for us. So typically when we describe a natural history of a patient with chronic liver disease, in the initial stages, we just have liver cell injury and some scar tissue being laid down. When this injury culminates into nodule formation separated by the scar tissue, we call it the stage of cirrhosis. So like I said, in the initial stages, the function is preserved, only the liver is scarred and looks abnormal. And as time passes by, the scar tissue becomes more mature. These nodules continue to form at varying rates, and this induces certain changes into the splanchnic circulation, and that leads to vasomodulation. And over a period of time, the patient starts to lose function, which is lost by way of both liver cell function as well as sequelae to portal hypertension or the scar tissue or the stiffness of the liver. So the commonly encountered complications in clinical practice are those of variceal hemorrhage, ascites, encephalopathy, and jaundice. So these are what are called as the decompensatory events. So that means the cirrhotic patient who was compensated transits to the decompensation stage when any of these events happen, and then this ultimately leads to death. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very simple schema of things. So you can die because of a non-liver related cause also. So for example, if a chronic liver disease patient who's got NASH, wherein we know that there is a very high uh, predilection for cardiovascular events, major adverse events which are cardiovascular, then this patient, even before he reaches the stage of cirrhosis or decompensates, can die. So you have competing causes leading to death. Also, what is not recognized up until a few years ago is that even someone who's got chronic hepatitis B might have get an intercurrent infection, and transiently this liver fails. So you can get transiently some features of decompensation, but as and when this infection is taken care of, the patient again transits back into the earlier stage of cirrhosis, albeit a few notches higher than what it was at baseline. So this is a very dynamic process. So this has been defined over here in a linear fashion, but in no way this is linear. and one thing need not go on to other. For example, if someone with chronic hepatitis B gets a bad lower respiratory tract infection and forms edema and ascites, you will not say that this patient has developed decompensated cirrhosis, because once this intercurrent infection gets better, this patient is again going to go back to the compensated state. So that is why there can be a number of competing diagnoses leading to loss of function in a patient with chronic liver disease. So like I mentioned, the problems that can occur in patients with cirrhosis could A, be due to the stiffness of the liver, which we describe as portal hypertension, or B, it could be because of liver cell dysfunction or liver cell failure. So the problems arising due to portal hypertension are variceal hemorrhage, ascites, and encephalopathy, and those which are arising typically from liver cell dysfunction are jaundice and encephalopathy. And please remember that once a patient with chronic liver disease and portal hypertension develops ascites, he gets predisposed into he gets predisposed to a number of other complications like spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, refractory ascites, hepatorenal syndrome, so on and so forth. So one problem can easily lead to another, and this is why identifying each of these complications early is extremely important. Also, when you see patients in your clinical practice, it's not necessary that the patients will have the components of both portal hypertension and liver insufficiency. Just to give you an example, most of us actually see patients who've got very difficult to manage ascites. That means ascites which is not responsive to diuretics. But if you look them up in the eye, you find that they're hardly icteric. So this is one condition in which you have normal bilirubin values, but you will find that this patient has got difficult to manage ascites. So this is typically a patient who's got portal hypertension related sequelae. On the other hand, patients that we see who are extremely sick in the context of, say, severe alcoholic hepatitis, in the initial stages, you will find that these people are deeply jaundiced. They are very cholestatic, but they might not have any edema or ascites. Of course, as the liver cell dysfunction becomes well and truly established, they can develop features of portal hypertension also. So it is not necessary for a given patient to have both sequelae to stiff liver as well as sequelae to liver cell dysfunction. So they may or may not occur together. So this is the classic D-Amico's classification, or the time or temporal course of a patient with chronic liver disease slash cirrhosis. So D-Amico, over a period of time, they describe what happens to patients with cirrhosis as they are followed up over a period of time, actually a number of years. So the first stage is when the patient has got cirrhosis, but he does not have any features of portal hypertension. So this was initially described as no varices. So please remember that in early years of description of chronic liver disease, the scientists and clinicians were in morbid fear of this complication, which was variceal hemorrhage. Now we know in recent years that probably the non-variceal hemorrhage is more difficult to handle than variceal hemorrhage, and probably it entails much greater insight into knowing what is going on in a patient with portal hypertension. So first stage was no varices. The second stage was the patient with cirrhosis had varices, and the third stage was that this patient could decompensate, or this patient could have just bleeding. So what you see on the side, these numbers, these are the numbers which signify the chance of this patient dying. So patients who've got cirrhosis but no varices, very low rates of death at the end of 1 year, that is less than 2%. Once they develop varices, these patients' rate of death increases substantially, and once they decompensate, this goes up even further. The lower part of the slide, you see that you could have somebody who's got either only bleeding, that means varices are present and bleeding is there, and this is stage 3, but this patient can also have features of decompensation in the form of ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, jaundice, but may not have bled. So please remember that decompensatory events, the commonest is ascites, that is seen in about 30 to 50% of patients with cirrhosis, and that has a far greater chance of the patient succumbing to this complication than anything else. And if you have a combination of both bleeding as well as ascites, then you are at the other end of the spectrum, and the chance of dying is almost 1 out of 3, or 27%. What was not described in the initial description by D. Amico of the timetable of cirrhotics is what you see in this slide in the red. So like I said, you can have somebody who's not even a cirrhotic can develop renal dysfunction or acute kidney injury. We have to be extremely careful about the occurrence of HCC, which can occur at all stages. So as we'll probably get time to discuss, so now it is not necessary that you have to be F4 fibrosis on Metavir. even F3 fibrosis can predispose to HCC, and that can occur at any time. So someone might never have decompensated, never ever could have had jaundice or ascites or edema or have bled, and still you might find this patient to be harboring a hepatocellular cancer or a HCC. And then any super added insult to a patient who's got a scarred liver can produce the syndrome of acute and chronic liver failure. So these three are the new additions to the DMECO's timetable of the natural history of cirrhosis followed for a period of year. So these three are, they can actually dent this natural history. All of them are known to produce high mortality, and during the course of the talk, we will talk about all these three events separately. So what I have said in the last few minutes is that patients, when they lose function, they actually go on to have a reduced survival. And this was shown by Peter Gines many years ago, that the median survival of patients who have got a scarred liver but continue to remain compensated, that means they don't have jaundice, ascites, encephalopathy, bleed, so on and so forth, and they will go on to live. Median survival is about 10 years. Whereas the moment any of these decompensatory events happen, this median survival drops down to about 1.5 years. So the probability of survival depends on the loss of function. So just merely having a cirrhotic liver, which is what Dr. Patwari said right at the outset, we see so many patients of cirrhosis, that does not mean that this is a death knell. You have to closely follow these patients and make sure that you can intervene in a timely manner so that you prevent loss of function. And these event or interventions we'll be talking of in the rest of this talk. So when we say that somebody has become very sick or a cirrhotic patient needs a transplant, what are we actually trying to allude to? And this is the brief that was given to me. So basically, we are talking of an individual who's actually having an unacceptable quality of life. That means this patient needs to come into the hospital time and again for one reason or the other, which could be variceal bleeding. It could be an ascites which is poorly responsive to diuretic therapy. This patient might have a severe episode of hepatic encephalopathy, or these events might occur ever so frequently. This patient might have some septic infective complication, the commonest of which is spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, but extremely common are also skin soft tissue infections, urosepsis, biliary sepsis, lower respiratory infections, so on and so forth, and bacteremias. Or this patient might develop acute kidney injury, which could be a very abrupt and severe one, or which could be protracted and indolent one. So these are now described as the type 1 and type 2 HRS respectively. And we will talk about this nomenclature in greater detail in the next few minutes. And like I said, that any time during the course of this patient's cirrhotic liver, we might develop hepatocellular carcinoma. So that is why any patient who's got cirrhosis, it's criminal not to keep them under surveillance. So all these patients, they have a predilection to develop HCC, any etiology of cirrhosis. So earlier teaching was that patients with Wilson's disease don't get, say, HCC, patients with autoimmune liver disease don't get HCC. That is not true. So any etiology of liver disease, the patient can develop hepatocellular carcinoma. And in earlier days, probably we were not seeing this complication because patients weren't surviving that long to develop this complication. So HCC is something that can occur at any point of time in a patient who's got cirrhosis in the background. So when we list patients for transplant, there has to be an objective manner of doing it. So you cannot say that somebody who's got, like I mentioned, that even a chronic patient can develop an intercurrent infection and he can have some edema, some ascites, some renal dysfunction, some loss of cognitive function. So please remember, even a non-cirrhotic patient, when he develops pneumonia, he does have neurocognitive impairment. So it's not uncommon for a patient with lower respiratory tract infection to come into the ER in a very agitated manner. So that does not mean that he's developed encephalopathy. So this is an organic brain syndrome, and it is going to reverse the moment this complication is taken care of. So you have to be sure that this complication that you are seeing is severe enough, is protracted, or is recurrent. So these three things have to be identified before you would ever want to list your patient for transplant. So first, the history of liver transplant. So it was only in mid 1980s that it was realized that liver transplantation is a definitive treatment for people with advanced liver disease. And in those days, the patients were listed on the basis of what was called as the minimal listing criteria. That means any patient who had got Child-Pugh B status, somebody who had complications of portal hypertension like bleeding, ascites, encephalopathy. These were the patients who were listed. Now, you can imagine that this is a very subjective criteria. So how were the organs allocated to these people? This was based on the length of time accrued on the wait list. So then it was realized that many of the centers in the Western world, they were preemptively listing their patients, because in the Western world, it's the insurance companies which pay for the transplant. Transplantation, even in the Western world, is big bucks, and therefore the people or the doctors were preemptively listing their patients even when they could be managed without a transplant. So this paved way for what was called as the UNOS criteria, United Network for Organ Sharing criteria. And the premise of using this criteria was medical urgency. That means the patient is extremely sick. So you had status 1 patients who had acute liver failure or who were not doing well after liver transplant and developed some complication like primary non-function or hepatic artery thrombosis and had to be relisted for a retransplant. Or these patients were divided into those who were status 2A, status 2B, status 3. So as programs were getting more and more mature, they started to take up patients who were terribly sick, status 2A patients. So this is probably what we see in the current parlance as patients who have got high acuity or acute on chronic liver failure. And obviously these patients, if they were not transplanted, they had markedly shortened survival, less than 7-day survival from the ITU. Status 2B slightly better than status 2A, but not fulfilling those criteria. And status 3 is what the new programs should do. So these are the patients who need a transplant, but they come from the community or from the floors. They are not ICU bound. Again, it was found that this particular UNOS criteria was based on the Child-Pugh score. So please remember, the Child-Pugh score is a very subjective score. So how do you assess encephalopathy? How do you assess the severity of ascites? So that is going to give you an extra score, and that is going to push your patient up the rank for organ allocation. And organs are a very, very scarce commodity. So whatever we have learned about transplantation or the principles of organ allocation has all come from the Western world. Just to give you a perspective, and for those in the audience who might not be involved in transplant, even in a country like USA, the wait list for liver transplant is roughly about 25,000 patients. And the number of transplants that happen on an annual basis is between 5,000 to 5,500. So there is a huge gap between what is needed and what we are actually providing. And even in a country like USA, the patient doesn't have to pay a single penny from his pocket. There is a high mortality on the wait list, and this is between 10 to 25%. That means 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 4 patient is likely to die even while they are waitlisted. So what do you do? So that means you are giving organs to those people who might actually benefit just with medical management, and they do not need a transplant. And this paved way for the score that we now use, which is called the Model for End Stage Liver Disease Score. So this was a landmark in the principles and of organ allocation, and the MELD score has been in vogue since February of 2002. So this particular score, and just to complete that, in the Child-Pugh score, you do not talk of renal dysfunctions. In all the 5 criteria that you use to calculate the Child-Pugh score, you do not talk of renal dysfunction. And actually, the short-term survival of any patient with chronic liver disease, renal function or dysfunction is the most important criteria. So that was the biggest pitfall of using the UNOS criteria. And the MELD score actually has a very high weightage given to the creatinine value. So you can have a MELD calculator on your smartphone or on your desktop. It needs only 3 parameters for the patient, which is the serum creatinine value, the serum bilirubin value, and the INR values. The scores as well as the short-term mortality is described in this slide. And therefore, it is absolutely obvious that we are allocating organs based on what is called the medical urgency. So again, for those who are initiated into transplant, the organs can be allocated in 3 different manners. One is medical urgency, which is described by the MELD score. The second is utility, and the third one is transplant benefit. So I'll take a minute to explain this concept. Now, when we see patients in our day-to-day practice, what is our biggest challenge? You want that this patient should not die. This patient should get the best possible treatment. If you have been following this patient for a fair length of time and you've realized that this patient needs a transplant, you want to keep this patient transplantable. So this is what is called medical urgency. That means high chance of dying if this patient continues to remain on the wait list. So in the last 18 years or so, ever since the MELD came into vogue, our principles of organ allocation have been based on medical urgency. That means chance of dying on the wait list. Now, does it mean that if this patient gets an organ, he will survive the transplant? That is the key question. So, like I said, organs are a very sparse commodity. So, medical urgency you can address, but you cannot talk of utility. So, utility means that you don't die on the wait list. That is besides the point, but you have got a very sparse commodity and therefore you must survive after the transplant. So, that is called utility. And the best score to describe the utility is the UKLD score. And lastly, transplant benefit, which actually is a metric involving both these two things. That means you should not die on the wait list as well as you should survive the liver transplant. Unfortunately, there is no score to define the transplant benefit. So we as scientific community would want the transplant benefit to be highest. That means you should not have the patient dying on the wait list. At the same time, you should make sure that the patient does not die post-transplant with a functioning organ. What is the meaning of that? That this patient dies of some other thing. That means this patient was too sick. You went in, it was an error and judgment of on your part. You put in a new liver, but this patient has died due to any other cause. This is almost like criminal because organs are a very, very sparse commodity. Now, those who are into transplant might argue that this holds no benefit for us because in our country, most of the transplants happen the living donor way. But I think as a principle, this is extremely important to understand. Even when we are talking of liver transplant in the living donor setting, especially transplant centers which don't have very high volumes, they end up actually choosing the worst patients. So that means the patient would be very sick. The donor might have some anatomic issues, or the donor might not be the best possible donor, and you will go ahead and transplant this patient. And therefore, in the post transplant period, you will have a lot of problems. So that is why transplant activity it evolves with maturity. So you have to be sure that you are choosing the right patient, and once the organ goes in, then this patient is going to survive after the transplant. So that is what is called as transplant benefit. But still, this is something which has an element of subjectivity because there is no objective score to define this. Over a period of time, the MELD found its modifications. And amongst these, and this is the one which we actually use now, that is the MELD sodium. So MELD sodium incorporates the serum sodium value of the patient who's got decompensated chronic liver disease. And why this is so important is because one of the commonest reasons for transplanting decompensated cirrhotics is diuretic refractory ascites. And typically, patients with diuretic refractory ascites, they have got low MELD scores. So in the US, if someone has got only diuretic refractory ascites, typically their MELD scores are 12 or 13. And unless your MELD score is more than 15, and since 2013, more than 35, you will be languishing on the wait list and you will not get an organ. So therefore, they incorporated the MELD sodium to define the medical urgency of patients who are waitlisted. A number of other MELD modifications are mentioned on this slide for someone who might be interested. And in acute on chronic liver failure, you have some of these scores which are better than the MELD sodium score. So what did MELD do? Intuitively, you would think that if you are transplanting people who are very sick, you will also be faced with high mortality in the post-operative period, right? So this is what clinical medicine tells you, that when you are handling patients who are extremely sick, these patients are likely to die. However, here a very important and a very expensive intervention has been made. So you do not want the patient to die. So this particular question was answered early on only in the first 5 years of introduction of MELD score. It completed or fulfilled its purpose of lowering the number of days on the wait list. So as you can see in this curve, the number of days on the wait list after 2002 February has been steadily coming down. And what about the deaths on the wait list? This is obviously the reason why the MELD was advocated. So that obviously after 2002 has been coming down. So people who are on the wait list, we did not want them to die, and MELD scored perfectly in that respect. There are some exceptions. That means there are certain conditions or certain problems that a cirrhotic patient might have, which are not covered by the MELD score. So like I said, this particular score only involves the bilirubin values, the creatinine value, and the INR value. I've already discussed the case of refractory ascites, which is one of the commonest reasons for which we do transplants in our country. Persistent encephalopathy patients also may have got a MELD score of less than 15. Patients who've got refractory GI bleed, especially non-varicose, might again have low MELD scores. Patients with hepatopulmonary syndrome, portopulmonary hypertension, familial amyloid polyneuropathy, not very common in our country, neuroendocrine tumors, some of the rare varieties of cholangiocarcinomas which are still considered for transplant. This is not for the uninitiated. Patients who got hepatic endothelioma, polycystic chronic liver disease, liver disease, and those who've got recurrent cholangitis in the context of PSC or otherwise, who are candidates for liver transplant. So these are called MELD exceptions. So when you have somebody who's got these exceptions, this case is presented to the regional review board, and it is then decided or adjudicated on merit to say that yes, this patient will get extra points and he should be allocated an organ. But like I said, this is in the context of deceased donor transplant, and this is what is practiced in the Western world. So the next question which Dr. Yogesh wanted me to address is, does every patient with liver cirrhosis need a transplant? So how do you answer this question? Probably I would want to split this answer into three categories. A, patient is not very sick. So that means we should not just go ahead and think that just because somebody is a cirrhotic, I have to continue him on surveillance. He might develop HCC, he might decompensate, and therefore why not put in a new liver when everything is still fine? That means the patient is not so sick. Mind you, this is also a kind of a exercise in futility, and I will describe this in a moment. The second situation is the patient is too sick to transplant. That means you will take this patient to the ER, you will put in a new liver, but this patient will probably still end up dying. And that is really criminal because this organ could have gone to someone else. An organ is a very sparse commodity. Even in the living donor setting, this is extremely difficult to handle because oftentimes these patients die while even the donor is still in the hospital or in the ICU. So the average stay of living donors in most ITUs is about 5 to 6 days. And some of these patients are so sick that they might succumb to the operation as well as the complications thereof in the first 2-3 days of surgery only. And it's a nightmare for those of us who have to then handle or address this issue to the donor. So this is the other end of the spectrum. And lastly, and which should be the focus of the discussion today, because I am told that most of the people who've logged in are actually physicians, which is, are there any interventions which may delay or abrogate liver transplant altogether? So let us come to all of these one by one. Not so sick. So this is one study which I would recommend everyone to read. So this might seem like a very old paper, but I think this is one of the finest papers in the MELD era that was published about liver transplantation. So this particular study, as you see on the hazard ratio bar diagram on the left, tells you that the hazard ratio becomes 1 at a MELD score of 15. So that is why all these slides you saw, I wrote MELD less than 15, MELD less than 15. So when the MELD score was advocated, it was decided that you had to have a MELD of greater than equal to 15, and then only you could have a shot at an organ. So what does this bar diagram tell us? Let us look at really low MELD scores, 6 to 11. So MELD score starts from 6 and is capped at 40. There are potential problems of capping at 40. Maybe we'll discuss them towards the end of the talk. So if you see someone who's got a MELD score of 6 to 11, look at that hazard ratio. That means what have you done? This patient was probably much better off being on the wait list only. So that means you have transplanted him and you have killed him. Ditto for the MELD score of 12 to 14. So only at a MELD score of about 15, this hazard ratio becomes 1. That means hazard ratio becomes 1 means the waitlist mortality as well as mortality after transplant, they can be equated. So low MELD scores, if you transplant them, there is a high chance that they would perish. Now, why does this happen? Again, this is counterintuitive. So you would think it's a stable patient. Why not transplant the patient when he's stable? All along I've been saying that the patient should still be transplantable. So here that variable is the organ quality. So please remember that when patients are given deceased donor organs, most of these organs come from people now who are old, who've been ICU bound, who've had some insult, either road traffic accident or a cerebrovascular injury, have stayed in the hospital for some days, in the ITU for some days, might have been subjected to some operative procedure, and they might also have some underlying medical history. They might be overweight, obese, alcoholic, might have been on certain medication. So potentially that can ruin the health of the liver, and that liver is going to come to you. So that is why if you transplant patients with low MELD score, you are probably going to kill them. So this is what is defined as the DRI, donor risk index. So there is a mathematical score which tells you that if you are transplanting organs with a DRI of more than 1.7, then these patients' organ is likely to give you trouble in the post-operative period. So second thing, so one I said is the quality of the organ. The second most important thing is the complexity of this procedure. So liver transplant is one of the most complex procedures that is known to medical science, and it has got its own problems of plumbing. What do I mean by that? So you are removing the liver and you are putting in a new liver, and there are certain anastomosis to be made. And those anastomosis, they can go awry. So they can either be too tight or they can be too loose. And the most dreaded complication of liver transplantation is hepatic artery thrombosis. So if you were to even transplant normal people, and this is I am talking of experimental work, you will still have a mortality of about 9%. That means if you transplant 100 normal individuals, obviously you're not going to do that, but it is important to remember that you will end up losing 9 of them. So that is why this activity should not be reserved for those, or should not be offered to those who got a fair chance of surviving just with medical management. So therefore, if someone is not too sick, please do not offer transplant. So I put this case to rest. Second is too sick to transplant. So that means these are the patients, and I spoke a little while ago about capping the MELD. So some people feel that you should use an uncapped MELD. That means just feed in the parameters as they are and do not stop short at 40. So whatever is the calculated MELD score, use that as to define the patient's acuity. Acuity means patient is acutely unwell. So we are now transplanting many patients with who have got a MELD score of more than 35. Even in the US, since June of 2013, they have stopped using the share 15. They have started using the share 35. That means if there is an organ available regionally, that has to be shared, and that organ will not go to that hospital where it is available from. So that has to be shared or has to be offered to someone who has got a high MELD score, and that is defined as a score greater than equal to 35. So that means again medical urgency. We do not want people to die on the wait list, so we have started to transplant people who have got very high MELD scores. So obviously people who have got very high MELD score or people who have got organ failures. That means patient was on a ventilator, or he was on renal replacement therapy, or he was on inotropes, or this patient is recovering from a bad infection. So these are the patients who are potentially going to give you trouble in the post-operative period also. And you have to define your own criteria to say that yes, now he's too sick and I am not going to consider him for transplant. At times, these things might not be there, but just the other patient parameters of the patient phenotype might not be good. So it's not uncommon for many of us now to be transplanting people who are in their 60s, 70s. Patient has background of coronary artery disease, chronic obstructive airway disease. We define these by what is called as the Charlson Comorbidity Index, CCI, and patient might be having multiple comorbidities. So therefore, the procedure, the quality of organ, those are not an issue, but the patient phenotype is an issue, and such a patient might die in spite of a successful transplant. So these are the patients who are too sick to transplant, and therefore one has to be very wary of transplanting people who are too sick or wherein you think that this patient will not survive the procedure. And for our country, and this was shown almost a decade ago when we were not even talking of share 35, that people who have got high MELD scores, the cost of transplant, the use of renal replacement therapy, ICU readmissions, that means was sent to the floor, came back in again, length of stay in the ICU. So they were all much higher in people who were MELDers greater than equal to 24. So this is a study from King's College. Now, of course, we are talking of here 35, and probably this would be even more acute. However, their survival was not affected. So it was a similar kind of survival regardless of the MELD score, but the amount of resources that were used to salvage this patient was much higher. So remember, in the UK, you have the National Health Scheme or the NHS. So the patient is not having to, but in our country, when we are transplanting these people, we are bound by some economic packages, and you have to make sure that they are able to do this procedure well within that package. So resource utilization at high MELD is enormously high. So it is not going to alter the outcome. It will not alter the survival at 1 year, but it will come at a huge cost. And therefore, in our country, this is very relevant. So the cost is a major consideration because of which many people cannot afford transplant. So these are the things that you have to bear in mind. So not so sick or too sick to transplant. Then what about the third thing which I mentioned, which is any intervention which might delay or abrogate liver transplant altogether. So this is actually the most important thing for those who logged into today's clinical session. So we must first start attacking the cause. So whatever produced the liver scarring, you have to try to treat that. So earlier it used to be hepatitis B, and many years ago, we had published this that even patients who got decompensated chronic hepatitis B, if you were to use nucleoside or nucleotide agents in them, you could recompensate them. That means their edema, ascites, encephalopathy could all get substantially better, so much so that they could be taken off the wait list also. In more recent years, we've had success with the directly acting antivirals in the context of hepatitis C also. But again, one has to be careful. Unlike hepatitis B and hepatitis C, we are bound by certain things. So it is not as if to say that any patient with hepatitis C, you would want to treat them with DAs. So you have to exercise caution, and probably this should be done only at experienced centers. Patients with chronic cholestatic liver disease, again, patients with primary biliary cholangitis. So we know that you can alter the natural history of primary biliary cholangitis when you use drugs like urso, and in more recent times, drug like obeticholic acid. So you can alter the natural history of this disease, and again, this patient will have a very slow progression of disease. So this is an intervention worth making. Use of corticosteroids in autoimmune chronic liver disease. Again, one has to be a little careful. Don't do it for people who've got very high MELD scores. Don't do it for people who've got very poor blood flows to the liver or who've got encephalopathy. But if it is started at the right moment, at the opportune moment, then again you can recompensate this patient. You find the NASH fibrosis cirrhosis in italics because we still do not have approved drugs which have been used for a long period of time to say that yes, this actually alters the natural history. In fact, there are some studies, albeit retrospective, where even people who've got decompensated cirrhosis, they have been treated with vitamin E or metformin, and it has been shown that their transplant-free survival is favorably affected. But this is still not the standard of care. So whatever I have described in the top three indications, that is the standard of care. Like I mentioned, diuretic refractory ascites is one of the commonest reasons for which we do transplant. So if your patient case selection is good, some of these patients you will be able to manage even by placing a TIPS stent. So this is an interventional radiologic procedure. We do it very often in patients who've got diuretic refractory ascites. Less common now for patients who've got refractory bleeds because endoscopy has really made strident advances, and therefore most of the times the TIPS insertions are done for this particular indication. The patient selection has to be very astute. Patients should typically have good cardiac function. They should not have high MELD score. Patients should not have had any episode of non-precipitant encephalopathy in the past, and you should also be wary of the age, the serum sodium, and the serum creatinine value. So again, try to pick on the brains of someone who's been doing this regularly so that you would be able to have a good patient selection. And mind you, these patients do extremely well. So for some time, they will still need diuretic therapy, but they will become diuretic responsive. They gain back their muscle mass, and that is very important. So TIPS is now believed to be an excellent remedy for sarcopenia, which is muscle loss or muscle wasting in patients with chronic liver disease, which is not commensurate with the age of the patient. So this is again something that you should bear in mind. Now, at times we would see patients in whom you will have recurrent hepatic encephalopathy. But if you look at the other functions of the liver and the patient phenotype, you will find that this patient otherwise looks quite well preserved. So in such patient, always make an active effort to see whether you can localize a single or more than one shunts, which could be the reason for his recurrent encephalopathy. So very good imaging and shunt occlusion would be curative for a patient like this. In most instances, the recurrent hepatic encephalopathy is a function of poor liver status. So I'm not saying that this is what you see most commonly, but every now and then you will encounter a patient who otherwise has got good albumin, no edema, no ascites. The only thing is neurocognitive impairment, and therefore at times we try to, we try to say that all these patients are a homogeneous cohort. The answer is no. In a patient like this, go ahead, do proper cross-sectional imaging, try everything possible to locate if there is a shunt which you can occlude, and then this patient's encephalopathy is likely to get better. And then last but not the least, and this list is incomplete, it is resection or ablation for a patient with liver cancer. So when the MELD score was advocated, the number of transplants that they used to happen for HCC, that increased tremendously. Why? Because HCC patients were being transplanted even when they had compensated liver disease. So they started to constitute even more than 30% of transplants in some centers in the US. Over a period, it was realized that again, this whole issue of the insurance companies paying for these transplants was the reason why the surgeons or the institutes were taking not so sick patient up and allocating organs to them. However, this is far more standardized now, and people who have got organ or tumors well within the criteria only can be listed. And in this, the tumor markers are also very important. So you might have a solitary tumor well within the Milan criteria, maybe 3.5 centimeter in the background of cirrhosis. But if the alpha fetoprotein is 1200, you cannot offer that organ to the patient. This patient must be downstage. You must show that the alpha fetoprotein declines, and then only you would be able to offer an organ to this patient. In more recent times, our knowledge, our perception, and our management strategy for HCC has undergone a paradigm shift. That is, we have now started to realize that people who we thought were good candidates for transplant, they are having recurrence after transplant, and some people who we thought were not so good and would have a high chance of recurrence are not having a recurrence after transplant. So this is what is called as tumor biology. So please remember, in the Western world, the average waiting periods for patients with HCC would still be more than 6 months, whereas we in our country falter on account of doing a rapid transplant for these patients, and in the process, we are not able to understand or comprehend the natural or biological behavior of the tumor. So you could have even a 2 centimeter tumor, which if one of my surgical colleagues who are there in the panel resect, the pathologist will tell that it is poorly differentiated HCC with evidence of vascular invasion. Now, what is this 2 centimeter lesion going to do if this patient were to undergo transplant? So that is a question that still remains unanswered. So to study the biological behavior of the tumor is extremely vital, and therefore we are now going back to the blackboard. We have now again started to see the relevance of biopsy. Resection is extremely important, and there is a concept of salvage transplant. So that means if there is a patient who is a cirrhotic and has a resectable HCC, so please remember that there are only 3 curative treatment options for HCC in a cirrhotic patient. Ablation for small lesions less than 2 centimeters, maximum 3, resection, and transplant. These are the only 3 curative options available to a patient with cirrhosis who has got a HCC. All other options are palliative. So if you resect and you find that there is bad histology, then this patient has got 2 pathways to go. Either you offer him early transplant or you take him off for transplant list completely, thinking that this patient will have a high chance of recurrence even if you put in a new graft. And again, there are some gray areas in this, and maybe this can come up for discussion. So resection, ablation for HCC is again one intervention that might delay or abrogate liver transplant altogether. So in the last part, last few minutes, I would like to talk about some things which would be dear to our physician and surgical colleagues who are logged into this clinic. So these are non-liver directed interventions. Not all of them, but most of them. So that means, are there certain things which we can do in a cirrhotic patient which can again alter the natural history or maybe prevent some complications from occurring in these patients? And what are these complications? Like we described, decompensation, HCC, and liver related mortality. So these three terms you will hear again and again in the next few slides. So many years ago, it was shown in this study, which was a German American initiative, that even in patients with compensated cirrhosis, their survival, it is a function of hepatic venous pressure gradient. That means if the liver pressure is high, even though you might seem to be compensated, but you have got a higher chance of surviving. So what discerns somebody with compensated cirrhosis to have either a good course or outcome, or to have a turbulent course in the times to come? So this is the key question which all of us must try to answer when we are faced with this situation. So as you can see that the cumulative survival in those who have got an HVPG of more than 10 is far less than those who have got an HVPG of less than 10. So this 10 millimeters of mercury is a very, very important figure which we should all bear in mind. And this forms the basis of what is called as CSPH, clinically significant portal hypertension. That means not all cirrhotics have got clinically significant portal hypertension, but those who have got CSPH, they are the ones that should be really the focus of your attention. So this formed the basis for this landmark study, which was published in the Lancet last year. So this was the prediction of decompensation in a patient with cirrhosis. So this is the PREDESCI trial published from Barcelona. So what these investigators did was take up cirrhotic patients, check the acute response to intravenous propranolol. Those who had a decline of HVVG of more than 10% of baseline, they were randomized to receive either propranolol or carvedilol, and the remaining group was the control group. So you have essentially the placebo group of 100 patients, beta blocker group of 100 patients. 2/3 of the beta blocker group received propranolol, 1/3 received carvedilol. So what does this particular forest plot tell you? So this forest plot tells you that was there any difference in the Child-Pugh score? No. Varices? No. HVPG going to a stage where bleeding would become imminent? No. None of these are significant. Cause of this high HVPG? No. But all events which predict decompensation, that means jaundice, encephalopathy, bleed, death, ascites, they were 16% in the beta blocker group and 27% in the placebo group, which is what I have delineated by these green and the red circles. So if all of these are same in the beta blocker group and placebo group, so what is different? That is formation of ascites. So I already mentioned right at the outset that ascites is the commonest decompensatory event in a stable cirrhotic, occurs in about 1/2 of these patients as the first event. When these patients were followed up for a median of 37 months, you can see the hazard ratio for survival. That means patients who were treated with the beta blockers, non-selective beta blockers, they had got a much better chance of survival. So this is the PREDESCI trial. So all these years we were only talking about beta blockers in the context of bleeding. Now herein you see a very good robust study which tells you that even formation of ascites is favorably affected by the use of non-selective beta blocker. So this is one intervention that you have to be careful about. Now, why did I say non-liver related? So obviously you would think that this is liver related, but we have started to understand now that beta blockers have got very many different effects, and most important effects are what it does to the mucosal integrity of the bowel, what it does to translocation of bacteria or their products into the portal circulation. So this is the one of the important things that we have learned from this study, that it has got nothing to do only with the portal pressure or the liver pressure or the liver stiffness, but there are other pleiotropic effects also. So this is use of beta blockers in the non-varicose bleeding setting. Now let's talk of another thing. So this is a study from Vienna, excellent study. So this study was not intended to be a liver study. This was only to see whether the guideline permissible use of statins was being done in patients who had got also incidentally chronic liver disease or not. So all of us know that what are these guideline conforming use of statins. So patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, those who have got an LDL baseline cholesterol of more than 190, those who have got either diabetes in this age group and an LDL between 70 to 189. So these are the ones who should ideally be given statins in any part of the world. Now, if these patients also happened to be cirrhotics, it was seen that very few patients who had an indication but were not on statins. Number of patients who received statin according to indication, and those who had no indication and did not receive statin. So our focus should be those who have an indication but did not receive statin. Why? Because statins are perceived to be potentially hepatotoxic. So many physicians, even our peers, even gastroenterologists, hepatologists, feel that statins are potentially hepatotoxic and therefore they should be used very carefully in the cirrhotic population. So forgive me for this Kaplan-Meier curves, but I would just run you through this slide. So the first one is pooled cohort, non-advanced chronic liver disease and advanced chronic liver disease. So all the subjects of this study were subjected to a transient elastography. So advanced is a kPa value of more than 10 and non-advanced is a kPa value of less than 10. So no indication for statin, and second is patient on statin, and third is no statin despite indication. So just look at the red curve because it's a slightly cramped slide. Look only at the red curve. So you will find that in the pooled cohort as well as in the non-advanced chronic liver disease, the log rank test is clinically or statistically significant. However, in the advanced chronic liver disease, Kaplan-Meier, this significance is lost. That means someone who's got a non-advanced chronic liver disease, that means an LSM of less than 10, but has got an indication for use of statin and is a cirrhotic, please go ahead and use statins, because when you follow up these patients have got a higher chance of survival. So the message is patients even with lesser degrees of portal hypertension, if they are cirrhotic, then these patients should be treated for statins when they have got an indication. The next is the use of statins and hepatocellular carcinoma. So this is again publication from last year. This is based on the Swedish registry data for the use of statins between 9 years, 2005 to 2013. So what this particular study tells you is that this benefit that is seen in the cumulative incidence of HCC being lower with the statin use is only seen with the lipophilic statins. And if those of us who are clued in, we know that the lipophilic statins, they have got pleiotropic effect. The case in point is simvastatin. It is anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, anti-angiogenic. It is pro-apoptotic for certain pathways. It modulates endothelial function. This particular property was lost in the hydrophilic statins. So statins like you use pravastatin or rosuvastatin, this does not have that property of benefit in decreasing the occurrence of HCC in the cirrhotic patients. So the message is lipophilic statins. In the previous study, you saw the benefit with respect to survival, and herein you see the benefit with respect to the cumulative incidence of HCC. Next, come to the use of aspirin. Again, we gastroenterologists, hepatologists are in morbid fear of using aspirin in patients with chronic liver disease. Of course, I am not saying that someone who's got hypersplenism, a platelet count of 20,000, you'll go and treat them with antiplatelet agents, but patients who got platelet count between say 70,000 to 100,000 or between 100,000 to 150,000, there is a strong case to be made for use of aspirin in the cirrhotic population. Again, this is Swedish registry data. Patients were followed up for a period of 8 years. And here you can see in these two curves that the cumulative incidence of liver-related mortality and cumulative incidence of HCC was much lower in the patients who were treated with aspirin. And this was low dose of aspirin, mind you, less than 100 milligrams. But all these patients had received aspirin at least in their prescription for more than 90 days. And it was also seen that there was a direct benefit of the longer use. So those who had got higher number of aspirin years, they did the best. So again, to make a case for use of aspirin in patients with chronic liver disease. So mind you, in this study cohort, most of the patients were hepatitis B and many more hepatitis C, because that is the commonest etiology of chronic liver disease in this part of the world. So this was a study from the insurance database. So this is from Taiwan. In Taiwan, every patient's data is captured on this insurance database. And again, you can see that now a selective cohort of chronic hepatitis B patients, mind you, not all cirrhotics, mind you, not all on nukes. Only 16% of the patients were on nukes. But what was protective was the use of statins, the use of aspirin, and the use of nukes. What was not protective was age of the patient, the male sex, and this patient having other complications of chronic liver disease as cirrhosis. So those which were negative predictors was the age, the male sex, and liver cirrhosis, and those which were beneficial was the use of nucleotide agents, statins, and aspirin. So again, large patient cohort, and it was shown that the use of antiplatelet agents was beneficial in the cumulative incidence of HCC. So like I said, at least it had to be given for a period of more than 90 days. And again, longer the duration of use of aspirin, greater the benefit. Lastly, let's talk about what we know or what we oftentimes term as a slow progression of liver disease. So every now and then the fellows in training will ask, why does a patient with compensated cirrhosis go on to develop decompensation? So this is a question which can fox many of us. There is a concept of parenchymal extinction. There is a concept of microcirculatory changes which happen in patients with cirrhosis. So it is believed that what we see on imaging, which is basically the splenic vein, the superior mesenteric vein, the portal vein, we try to see the phasic variations of these with the respiration. That is only one part of the story. The description of cirrhosis, which I gave right at the onset, is something which produces scarring, neoangiogenesis, vascular changes, and modulatory effects of this resistance of the liver to the splanchnic circulation. So it was shown in this French-Italian study, which was done quite a while ago, that if you were to use enoxaparin in patients who did not have PVT, so mind you, most of us use the low molecular weight heparin to treat portal vein thrombosis in patients with cirrhosis, it was seen that the probability of PVT, the probability of decompensation, and probability of survival was much, much higher in patients who were treated with anticoagulation. So what does this do? This probably alters this microcirculatory changes that I described. This probably lowers the occurrence of parenchymal extinction, which I alluded to a little while ago. And that is how this is known to alter the natural history of a patient who actually does not need this. So this is not a patient who's got PVT at outset and you're treating them with heparin. So these are the various interventions, and mind you, this list is not complete. You can talk of rifaximin, you can talk of antibiotics, you can talk of caffeine. You have a number of interventions that are known to alter the natural history, not necessarily prolong survival. So I chose only these few because this seems to be robust data in these studies and probably needs more studies like this to be validated from other parts of the world. Unfortunately, this enoxaparin study was never done in any other part of the world for reasons that I don't know. But all of us know that when we carefully monitor our patients with cirrhosis who develop PVT, the sooner you go in and try to re-permeate the circulation to the liver, these people will have a much, much better outcome when it comes to recompensating them. So I think there is some merit in this principle. Lastly, this particular study, which again has caught the fancy of most of us, so this is not truly a non-liver directed, this is partially liver and partially non-liver. So this was a multi-centric Italian trial which was conducted over a long period of time. Patients who had got non-complicated ascites, mind you, these were not patients who had got refractory ascites. So these were the patients who were on modest doses of diuretics, which was defined as 200 milligrams of spironolactone and at least 25 milligrams of furosemide, and their ascites was still difficult to manage. They were treated with domiciliary albumin. So first 2 weeks they received 40 grams twice a week, and then they received 40 grams per week for a period of 18 months. First time it was shown that there was a benefit in survival. The hazard ratio of 0.6, that means about 38% improvement in survival when these patients were followed up for a period of 1.5 years in those who received the standard medical treatment plus human serum albumin. And it can be seen in the table mentioned below that the all-cause mortality, liver-related mortality, and the number of days spent in the hospital was all much more favorable in those who received the human albumin along with the standard medical treatment. The non-liver related causes were no different in the two groups. So this is again now which has got most centers fancy in a big way, and probably all of us are now advocating domiciliary albumin so that the patients would not come back in again for repeated paracentesis. So I think these interventions, if they are done in the correct cohort, they can either delay the need for transplant or abrogate the liver transplant completely. Now, what is the question that I have not answered? That is quality of life. Right in the beginning, I told that quality of life is one of the main reasons why you might want to offer transplant. But please remember, transplant is beyond means of many of us. And therefore, even with slight impairment of quality of life, if we are able to prolong survival, and then that is really worthwhile. So, colleagues, dear friends, and all of those who logged in, we know that cirrhosis is a syndromic diagnosis, but it is not a homogeneous condition. So there are finer nuances to the etiologic agents, and we should actually intervene in early course of cirrhosis when I said the collagen is not mature. So please remember, when we were medical students, we were taught that cirrhosis is an irreversible condition, but we know now that that is not true. In the context of hepatitis B, in the context of hepatitis C, it has been shown with serial biopsies done over a period of 5 to 6 years that there can be major, if not complete, reversal of fibrosis. However, a pure, solely the pure a pure anti-fibrotic therapy has still not seen the light of the day. So much of research has gone in. Millions of dollars have been spent on trying to find out something which is just anti-fibrotic. So in the beginning, I described two ways. One was the liver stiffness, one was the liver cell dysfunction. So if we had some tool by which we could actually break down the scar tissue in the liver, that would be really helpful. But unfortunately, none of the treatments that have ever been used, even those which are directly linked to collagen linking, even they have failed. So there is something more than what meets the eye. So we sorely miss a pure anti-fibrotic therapy for these patients. We all feel, the scientific community feels that there is a stage in the time course of a cirrhotic patient when life becomes almost unlivable. And that is the time when you should suggest transplant. We describe this condition as ESLD. But I would like to ask all those who are logged in today, what is ESLD? So there is a definition of ESRD, but there is no objective definition of ESLD. All of us define it very differently. And therefore, we should always try to be as objective in laying down the criteria for the suggesting transplant as possible. Like I said, liver transplant is beyond the means for most for various reasons: financial, availability of organ, adherence to compliance to medication, the psychosocial milieu from which the patient comes. So these are various things that you have to bear in mind, but many a times we are just carried away by the acuity of the liver disease and do not try to probe into the other nuances of transplantation. Please remember that liver transplant cures a serious disease, but it itself is a lifelong disease. So we must remember that the problems to adherence, compliance, finances, the metabolic and the other complications of immunosuppression, including renal dysfunction, de novo malignancies, recurrence of the disease for which you are transplanted. So these are also the conditions that you should be thoroughly aware of before you suggest transplant to a given patient. And with this, I would like to conclude, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, for excellent presentation. You have touched upon most of the relevant issues, and you did send across the message to help us decide which are the patients who should be offered transplant. Now, just to start the question answers, my first question to you is age a criteria? Any age, particular age beyond which you would be uncomfortable transplanting the patient? That's
That's
one.
an excellent question.
Yeah.
So we now all transplanting people who are much, much older than what we used to do. And I always say that age is a number. So oftentimes you see young people who have very poor physiology, and you would see people in their 60s and 70s who got robust physiology. But one must remember, and one must discuss this very transparently with the family of the patient, that there is always an attrition to age when you transplant someone. We still don't know what that number is, but most of us feel that it is by 6 to 7 years. What is the average lifespan of an Indian male? It's about 77 years. What is the average lifespan of Indian women? It's about 72 years. I think it's much lower, but this is what the statistical data would make you believe. So if there is someone who comes to me who's got 72 or 73-year-old male and says that I want a transplant, the whole team should be involved in that decision making. So even though there might be a pressing reason, a relevant reason, a just reason for transplanting, but we should discuss this particular issue with the patient's family. So I think it has to be individualized.
Yes. Now, sarcopenia is also one of the very important aspect. And how do you assess sarcopenia, and which patients with sarcopenia you would not operate?
So I think sarcopenia is just a description of somebody losing muscle mass which is not commensurate for their age. So again, this is something that I would want to mention here, that sarcopenia was actually something that we picked up from the geriatric practice. But if you were to go into the history of sarcopenia, it was first described as early as 1948 in cirrhotics only. But somewhere along the way, we stopped talking about it. The geriatricians took it from us. And then again, in the last decade or so, we have again started to talk about it. So for us, more important is the functionality, which is described by the frailty. So we should not think that sarcopenia and frailty are synonymous, though in more than one ways, one represents the other. What we do in our practice is to use the functional status, which is more common. So what do I mean by that? Most of us are subjecting our patients pre-transplant to cross-sectional imaging. We are all aware of the skeletal muscle index figures, which is about 40 to 42 for Indian males, about 32 to 38 in the women. So if I find that the SMI is low, but this patient has got a good 6-minute walk test, this patient is able to work out on the CPEX, this patient is able to do the short physical performance battery very nicely, I would not take this patient off the transplant list. Having said that, we would continue to work on the patient's nutrition, and most of us, we know that there is the protein component of the nutrition that is missing, as well as absence of exercise. So these two things have to be given special emphasis. And unfortunately, again, in the living donor transplant setting, the time between the patient coming to you and time with the patient being offered transplant is very short. So again, if you see the sarcopenia and frailty studies, they come from the Western Hemisphere because patients have got a finite time on the wait list. And in most programs in the US, again, this time would be anywhere from 6 months upwards. And therefore, these nutritional interventions probably hold some logic. In our country, it's mostly giving nocturnal feeds. It's mostly to satisfy you. I can tell you that there is no good study which tells you that the measures become better. So you are only talking or targeting one component, which is the nutrition. But of course, the science behind this is robust. So to answer your question, functionality more important, frailty more important than just the muscle mass being low.
Yeah, I can't agree more with your statement. Now, acute on chronic liver failure, as ACLF, is something which is now talked about quite a bit, and more patients with ACLF are being considered for transplant. So, what is your take on that?
Right. So I think most centers are now transplanting patients with ACLF, and these are either the flares of autoimmune hepatitis, reactivation of hepatitis B, and the most common, of course, remains severe alcoholic hepatitis presenting as ACLF. So again, you have to be mindful of what I mentioned in the slide, too sick to transplant. So the number of organ failures that the patient has at the time you take up these patients for transplant. And at times also the organ failure in particular. So somebody who's got a creatinine of 2, is in encephalopathy, is on some dose of inotropes, is much better than someone who's got none of these but is on ventilator. So of all the organ failures, the respiratory failure is the one which has the greatest negative impact on outcome. So I think, and it has been shown in large databases that if you've got more than 4 organ failures, then the chance of surviving the transplant is less. So in the interest of the finances as well as organ stewardship, one should avoid doing transplants for people who got greater than equal to 4 organ failures. Also, the trend is very important. So if you started up on high inotrope dose, that's coming down, the lactates are coming down, patient has started to pee a little bit, this patient's neurocognitive function is getting better, you might have an opportunity to intervene early. So many of these patients, especially those with ACLF3, you will never be able to get them in a truly optimal state to offer transplant. So each center has to have its own soft pointers as well as criteria which would tell you that yes, this patient is okay to take to the theater, and this patient, it is going to be an exercise in futility, and we should be very candid in accepting that.
Yes. Now there is a question from one of the attendees. There's a question from Dr. Kavesh Patel that is there any stem cell research in the field of cirrhosis to avoid transplant?
Right. So the regenerative medicine, as we call it, it's been there for a long time, but still not, we really don't understand that very clearly, still not become the standard of care. So in this context, GCSF, stem cells, then use of fecal microbiota transplant. So I said this list of interventions that I mentioned in the latter part of the talk is not complete, but these are the various things which have been tried, but none of them has been found to be reproducible across centers with respect to the results. So FMT, not everybody believes works. GCSF, most of us believe do not work. And there was that excellent realistic trial which was done in the UK, which actually was a negative study for the use of GCSF. So I think we still haven't reached there. There is promise, but we still haven't reached there. What is the reason for that? I think because the homing in of these pluripotent cells probably is extremely difficult in patients who got so much of scar tissue, who got 2 alternate pathways of blood reaching that organ. So I think there are various reasons why stem cell therapy probably is likely to fail in patients who got cirrhosis.
Yes. Dr. Hitesh, do you have any comment or any question?
Dr. Kapoor, excellent talk. You have covered so many aspects. I want to ask you regarding patients with HCC, in terms of living donor scenario. Suppose if patient comes with a 10 centimeter HCC, will you offer transplant, or will you downsize, or you upfront offer transplant? Particularly in our country, most of the centers are live donor centers. So what would be your approach in a child say cirrhotic?
G. So if you were to ask this question and want an honest answer from me, I think this patient will not remain at our center. He'll probably go to another center, because we are averse to offering transplants to people who are beyond the UCSF criteria. So at our center, we follow the UCSF criteria. And tumor is one thing which really takes the patient's peace away. So this patient might be led into believing that the doctor is not taking my problem very seriously. He'll go to the next transplanting unit who would be more than happy to transplant them. So if there is a chance for resection, definitely we would try to explore that, because therein the patient gets the confidence that yes, there is a curative treatment that has been offered to me. But both of you are surgeons and you know better than anyone else that the number of people who we see who have resectable lesions is very few. But if this patient has got good function, the bilirubin is not so high, there are no varices, platelet count is good, some of us still go by the holy grail of ICG retention. So these things you can do, and if you think that the resection is going to be safe, and by that I mean a mortality of less than 5% and a chance of post-operative liver failure less than 15%, one should go ahead and resect. If it's an educated family, and oftentimes one is surprised because if, and the trick that I play all the time is to tell the patient that send your data to a Western center. So obviously we are all in practice, and you don't want the patient to go to any other center, where he would be offered upfront transplant. And oftentimes that is a good way of retaining the patient and still be scientific. So if we find that not resectable, you tell them that this lesion needs to be downstage. Even smaller lesions with high alpha fetoprotein, we would be averse to suggesting transplant upfront. Any tumor in which there is obvious imaging involvement of blood vessels, we don't take. Extrahepatic, we don't take. I know some centers in North India are taking up patients who got the distal portal vein involvement, especially patients with the second or third order portal vein involvements. They are offering SBRT even to branch portal vein tumors, but we have not done that and we are averse to doing that, because I think because of the fact that we are doing living donor transplants, the onus is on us to make sure that we are doing the right thing and this patient doesn't get a recurrence. I think recurrence of the tumor, especially early recurrence after transplant, is almost like unacceptable. But still, at times, you will have egg on your face.
And would you offer transplant to somebody who is actively alcoholic?
Again, most of the, so I said 3 categories of patients with ACLF. So this is again something which nobody can answer, because what my experience has been, and we've been transplanting patients with severe ALCAP since a very long time, that the psychiatric assessment of these patients is never correct. So when someone is in a very dire state of health, they will say yes to everything that you ask them.
True.
And they will tell that I'll be compliant, I will behave like this, I'll be true to my family, true to my spouse, so on and so forth. But we all do know that recidivism is common in the post transplant period. Even in the sickest of patients whom you've transplanted, you might actually burn your finger. So this is something that we probably need to pay more attention to in the post operative period. So how to engage with these patients when they get discharged. So we all know that alcohol is a disorder of the mind, it's not a disorder of the body. But oftentimes we think we have done our part, and then this patient becomes like any other patient on follow-up. So I think the scientific committee on the whole also has to take part of the blame.
Dr. Patwari, sir, do you have
Yeah,
any?
yeah, I'm actually, as usual, excellent lecture by Dharmesh.
Thank you, sir.
And you have rightly mentioned the role of statins, especially simvastatin, aspirin in the management of chronic liver disease. Can you tell us little about the role of PPI in managing chronic liver disease? Because many of the times the treating doctors inadvertently they write PPIs in the management of
That's a super
chronic
question.
liver disease, and I think it should the message should spread to everybody about the role of PPI.
Yeah. So that shows that sir is what he is. So he's got a very good knack for attention to detail. So PPI is again is, so this is a negative connotation. So all of us realize that patients with chronic liver disease, they are either hypochlorhydric or achlorhydric. But still, the symptoms of dyspepsia are not uncommon in this population for a number of reasons, which is impaired transit, pressure or mechanical effect of ascites, so on and so forth. So there is good data to suggest that PPIs have an association with occurrence of SVP and other infective complications. Not so robust data about use of PPIs with hepatic encephalopathy, but with infections, especially SVP, this data is unequivocal. So that is why if you would see a prescription coming from our center, I always write PPI on demand. So you are not treating your patients with PPI. At the same time, you have to educate the patient and tell them that you should take this pill sparingly. Do not think that it's a part of your regular prescription, and take it only when your symptoms deserve so. As regards patients who are in the hospital and in the ICU, it's a big no. So we are extremely careful, especially those patients who are in the liver intensive care, not to use PPIs. So these are standing instructions for the ITU staff.
So nice. Thank you, Dharmesh.
So one last question, sir, if you allow me. According to PREDISTRI trial, you have mentioned the role of beta blockers. So would you recommend to all our audiences that we should start Inderal or propranolol in all compensated cirrhosis, irrespective of varices?
Right. So again, this particular study was a very well conducted study, and the patients had a baseline HVPG measurement, and this measurement was also repeated on an annual basis. The problem is that this is not something that all of us can do. However, the message from this study is loud and clear that earlier we were talking of the use of non-selective beta blockers only in the context of varices occurring, which was negative, growth in varices equivocal, varices grade 2 or higher, prevention of bleed, or secondary prophylaxis, yes. But this particular study tells you that probably even for the development of clinically significant portal hypertension, these drugs might have benefit. And what I didn't mention was that carvedilol scored over propranolol, even though it was used only in a third of patients. So I think I would not say dogmatically that we should be doing that, because oftentimes we don't look for the contraindications. But this is not something which is going to harm someone. So someone who doesn't have issues with intraocular pressure, peripheral vascular disease, you don't think that someone is a diabetic or has dysautonomia or a BHP, I find this innocuous. However, the way in which most of us use beta blockers, and one has to concede that not all of us are doing HVPGs, is again a little empiric. So we don't go by the declines. So mind you, I said that only those people who had an early response to intravenous propranolol, they were the ones who were relegated to the beta blocker arm. So we are not checking that on a continuous basis. You could still make a case for it, provided this patient is educated and can report with side effects. Whether to know that it is effective or not, that is another question, because we still use a very crude tool of a pulse rate going to below 55 or a systolic pressure going to less than 90 to say that you would want to tweak the dose. But would I be happy to do that? Yes, I would be happy to do that, because this is a low throughput kind of an intervention.
So what about aspirin? Aspirin, those who have platelet count between 75 to 1 lakh.
So
do
again,
you start in all patients, only indicated patients, or all cirrhotics?
Yeah, so again, see in the trials, so and I projected two. One is from the Swedish registry database, and the other is a uniform cohort of chronic hepatitis B. The message is clear, but again, this is not something that all of us are doing, because there are issues with platelet count per se in the lab reports that you get. So most of the times we rely on the Coulters to give the platelet count, which are oftentimes fallacious, and it's uncommon for me to see platelet counts of 75,000 and above, and more commonly I would see platelet counts much lower than that. So that is what is a little scary. And nowadays patients read up whatever the doctor is writing. So you will see that my platelet count is 40,000 and doctor has given me an antiplatelet agent. But again, I think the message is loud and clear. When you talk of microcirculation, it's got not just everything to do with the von Willebrand factor or the coagulants, but also to do with the platelets. So I think the science behind this is good, but to put it into practice, we are still a little distance away.
So can we wind it up now? Yeah, Dr. Yogesh, you can wind it up now.
So it was a very nice and lucid presentation. I hope all the audiences have really got a clear message that when to transplant and when not to transplant in liver cirrhosis. Once again, I thank our teacher, Dr. Patwari sir, Dr. Hitesh Chawda, and Dr. Chirag Desai to moderate and chair this session. And a big thank you to Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor. Thank you so much, sir, for this lucid presentation.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Good night. Stay safe.
Really enjoyed.
Again.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Good night.